Okay, it is now 11:20, and so I resume the hearing. The way things are going at present are not quite as neatly defined as I'd intended. Nonetheless, I think that we are covering the grounds that we need to in a reasonably orderly fashion, and so I think I intend to proceed as we are at present. Does that seem sensible to you, Mr. Elvin?
As long as you feel you're getting answers to the questions you have, then I'm content with whatever process you think is going to work.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Yes, I do normally aspire towards greater neatness, but nonetheless, I think slightly more rough and ready, but the job is being done. Okay, in order to be fair to the Council, because I don't want to overload you, do you want to come back on what we've just heard, or are you content for me to progress around the table?
I think I'd like to respond to that because it was quite lengthy, and I've got some points, and then I'm going to hand over to G.L. Hearn as well. I'm afraid most of what Ms. Cook said we don't accept. She has selectively quoted from the framework, and we ask you to look, as you will no doubt, at what paragraphs 15 and 16 say, but the directive is to look at the most up-to-date projections and then to adjust if necessary. But the mere fact there's a change after you've taken those projections doesn't mean that they're necessarily material. However, as I've said earlier, we've already adjusted for that. The methodology entirely aligns with what Mr. Bohr accepted in the Guildford Plan. We'll add the Guildford Plan to the examination library since it's been referred to. And I just ask you to cast your eye in due course at what we laughingly call your leisure, paragraphs 22 to 46. And whilst it's entirely right, as she pointed out, that there was an uplift of 79% above the projections, our uplift is not dissimilar. Our uplift is 63%. And she was incorrect in saying it neatly aligned with the standard method. My colleagues from G.L. Hearn will no doubt confirm this, but the standard method threw up 789 in Guildford, I'm told, and the figure that Mr. Bohr accepted was 562, which was in fact a reduction from the figure in the local plan. So one needs to be very careful in not jumping to conclusions, as with respect Ms. Cook and her clients have done with regard to that report. Second point is that we have adjusted for local conditions, and the Oxford report has not been properly read, and I appreciate it came in late, and I've already apologised for that. But can I just direct your attention in the Oxford report to the entirety of pages 19 and 20 and page 21. The Oxford report, the 680 comes from the old forecast period. There's a 610 from the new forecast period, which then goes to 660 on page 21, which we've already referred to. So that 660 doesn't come as a bolt from the blue. We'd already mentioned it. But the Oxford Economics Report looks at the other figures, such as the breast data. It explains why the past trends are not reliable for future forecasts. For example, the strength in terms of the wholesale and retail sector was now had to be moderated because the short-term outlook was particularly weak. And if you look at page 21, contrary to what was just said, Oxford Economics seek to align future sectoral trends with the strategic economic plans for York. And it sets out at the beginning of section 6, the scenario update, the detailed assumptions, 20% higher growth than the baseline with professional services, but 10% lower with wholesale and retail. So Oxford Economics have been assiduous to correct forecasts for specific circumstances in York. This is a York-specific report. So the idea that sensitivity hasn't been applied and that we've not been looking specifically at the York position carefully is simply incorrect. The whole purpose for commissioning the update was to make sure that you and we had the most up-to-date forecasts available, having regard to the circumstances of this city. Can I then hand over to JL Hearn just to raise a few points of detail?
Some very small points to add to that. There was some criticism about the lack of sensitivity testing, and I think that was made in relation to presumably paragraph 2A017 of the relevant planning practice guidance. Not going to go into the detail, but just to highlight that clearly the January 2019 report, Housing Need Update Report, CYC 9, clearly did look at sensitivity testing on both population and household formation. We had quite some discussion of the household formation already, but just to highlight paragraphs 2.13 to 2.15, concluding in table 5 of that report, do set out a series of alternative population-based scenarios, although the conclusion was alternative scenarios do not diverge substantially from the latest population projection, but noting that the 2014 previous population projection was a bit of an outlier. So that exercise was done within that report.
Just returning to the Oxford Economics paper, it should be stressed that, as was stated, that the Council have consistently used what was highlighted as Scenario 2. What we're seeing within this updated report is specifically Scenario 2 updated, and as I mentioned earlier, it shows a range depending on the time period that you look at of 660 to 510 jobs per annum. Bullet point 2 on page 21, or sorry, the 2 bullet points on page 21, it does specifically include an adjustment for 20% higher growth than the baseline projections within the professional services, financial and insurance and information communication sector. Now, that adjustment was made specifically to take account of developments such as York Central. So it's not that the Council are ignoring the growth potential of that particular development. In fact, they are embracing it, and that's the reason why they've chosen to go for this reprofiled sectoral growth scenario. The actual uplift itself, so we can look at that as being a positive step, because the previous chapter sets out what the baseline growth is. They've clearly made an adjustment to that baseline growth to take into account those wider factors. It was also drawn to your attention a number of other alternative data sets, job density, BRES, and APS figures, which I believe on average showed a growth of 794 jobs per annum. We're not disputing those figures. What we would say is that those are, that would mean adopting a trend-based forecast rather than, so a trend-based level of growth rather than forecast. As we suggested within our representations to your MIQs, that we do not believe that the trend-based forecasts are more robust than an economic forecast. Furthermore, this isn't just an off-the-shelf economic forecast. It's a forecast which is being led with local intelligence, inputting into that, and as a result has taken a positive step of increasing need above a baseline level of growth. The reason why we wouldn't recommend a trend-based forecast over a locally intelligent economic forecast is that they're very susceptible, as set out in our MIQs, about the trends or the years that those trends are drawn from. So, for example, the BRES data shows over the last 4 years, or over the last 3 years, a growth of 1,000 jobs, but within that period it masks a decline of 2,000 jobs and 1,000 jobs in one year and a jump of 5,000 jobs in the other. The BRES data is very reliant on the quality of the survey in that area, and we can see in other areas where that has been very questionable. It could, for example, take into account the HR function of a particular business where that's moves from one location to another. To give you an example, Mirror Group newspapers' HR function is in Liverpool, and as a result, all of the Mirror Group newspaper employees are said to be located in Liverpool. So that's just one of the failings of the BRES data, and it's really just a failure of the survey-based nature of that particular document. I should stress that pretty much all of the data sets being mentioned, including the economic forecast, all draw from that BRES data, but they should be tested, and that is exactly what Oxford Economics have done. Furthermore, they've taken into account these locally based initiatives. We also set out within our own report quite a good example of the impact of the years that you use to draw for employment trends. Using that same job density estimates on a linear trend, as we've set out in our MIQs, from 2000 to 2017, actually results in a trend of about 520 jobs per annum. So again, it's quite susceptible to whatever years that you're using, and that's why we don't necessarily wish to use them. Furthermore, what's happened in the past may not necessarily be happening in the future. We have seen that within the Oxford Economics paper, there's a real rationale behind why you would expect growth to be slower in the future than what we've seen in the past. That's all set out within the report, but to summarise, it includes low consumer confidence, uncertainty around Brexit. At a national level, Oxford Economics are actually forecasting the weakest economic growth since 2009. They do recognise that with the end of austerity, that the loosening of the fiscal stance may increase jobs. However, that will also be offset by deteriorating export environment as a result of Brexit, and also the lack of clarity over the final position of it. And because of that, companies are failing to invest in their companies until that is sorted. Other reasons why you would see a slowing rate of growth from historic trends is a rapidly ageing population. We're also expected to see restricted migration post-Brexit. And then within York, the output is also expected to contract. So there are those locally based elements as well, including poor consumer demand, which is taken into account within those forecasts. While there has been some growth over the last 10 years, that's been very inconsistent. In actual fact, there's only been growth in 4 of the last 10 years. We are still expecting there to be growth in York, and in fact, we are the Oxford Economics forecasts are relatively positive. They are projecting, or forecasting a growth rather, of 0.4% per annum, which is double the rate seen over the last 10 years. So any indication that the Council are using numbers which are too low based on past trends, I just don't think is realistic.
Mr. Austin Fell.
Thank you, sir. I have to admit I've got a little lost in the debate as things have moved on and the agenda has shifted a little bit. But I would like to try and just go back in sequence to some of the matters that have been raised and go through points relating to the household projections again. Ms Cook to the left of me was quite right in taking us back to para 15 of the PPG, which clearly indicates that household projections produced by the DCLG are the starting point. Now, we very much know that since that guidance was written, the DCLG are no longer custodians of that data. That has passed now to ONS. And despite this, the Council in their statement indicate at para 2.33 of their matter statement that these new projections produced by ONS are clearly the best evidence available. I'll come back to our point that we made earlier, sir, that we just don't consider them to be credible for the purposes of plan making. Whilst they may have their methodological or statistical robustness from the point of ONS, it's how they're used for plan making that's important. And I think here, sir, that there is a certain degree of robustness concerns that we would draw you to. I've mentioned previously the technical consultation on national planning policy and guidance in 2018. And while Mr. Elvin is quite right that this does relate to the standard method, there are observations within that report I think are very pertinent for us to look at here. I draw again your attention to paragraph 27.2, where the government reflect on the robustness of these projections, indicating that whilst the government generally recommends the use of the latest data in producing assessments of housing need, in this case referring to 2016, there have been substantial changes in the method producing the projections that have resulted in major changes for the distribution. I don't think this is something we can really ignore because...
Yes, forgive me, Mr. Austin-Felt. It's a curious thing, isn't it? Because I know what the Council's answer to this is going to be, not least of all because they've already said it, and that is that the government has said what it has said about the 2016 household projections and said that they shouldn't be used in relation to the standard method, as you point out, but what it has not said is that they shouldn't be used in relation to establishing an OAN under the transitional arrangements. And Mr. Elvin said earlier, to paraphrase, they could have done that, but didn't.
Quite right, sir. And I think
so I suppose my question to you is, what am I to make of that?
In the absence of what has not been said, and this is where I think, as previously made, we need to turn to what has happened. And as the Council would have it, they point very clearly to Guildford, though there are a basket of other decisions that we'd point you to as well. I don't want to make the evidence-based library overly burdensome, but if we are to include Guildford within the ranks, I think it's also necessary to consider Wickham, Nuneaton and Bedworth has been previously mentioned, and also...
I know a number of people around the table, including the Council, have pointed to my colleagues' reports and interim findings and the like in relation to other local plan examinations. I suppose on that I would say this. It's helpful, but only to a point, because, as you will appreciate, I'm sure this isn't the first local plan examination you've been to, but they're all different, and the evidence underpinning those plans is all very different in every case. And one thing I'm not going to do is spend my time here closely scrutinising the evidence that underpinned other examinations.
Thank you. So that's useful clarification on that matter. And as I said, I wouldn't want to burden the examination library unduly. So perhaps moving from that subject to the next, and again, turning to the sequence while we're remaining on the matter of the projections. The Council have indicated that an uplift has been made to the 2016 projections to account for household formation rate suppression, if you can hear me, sir. Now, whilst we don't disagree with the principle of uplifts per se, I think there's the case in point here that the uplift that has been made is very clearly only being made to certain age cohorts. So this is being made to those age groups 25 to 44. And whilst generally these age cohorts are those that have seen the greatest amount of suppression, it has to be queried whether or not it's a suitable mechanism to be applied a la carte across the district authority area. It's noted that the Council's approach, to return back to 2008, would lead to a more significant uplift than if they were to apply the 24 without adjustment. But inevitably, you get into this mismatch of running parallel projections against each other, and it becomes a little messy, to put it sort of bluntly. The approach we would like to see is that similarity between using the 2014 approach to the population projections and to the 2014 household projections as well. I think it's a more credible and it's a more consistent approach to take. Moving further to the point of employment, we're going to leave market signals, I think, for now. That's a topic that will perhaps come on to next. It's curious to note, because mention has already been referenced to Guildford as a notable examination. I just want to take you to that one, because there are some interesting observations from that, where Inspector Bohr, as part of a note he provided in June 2018, and for your reference, sir, that is reference LP005, he considered what he felt to be the robustness of the projections presented by the Council at the time. In respect of the projections, he notes, and I'll read, sir, these forecasts show a reduced growth compared to historic trends, but it's been observed that these forecasts are a snapshot and economic forecasts are well known to be volatile over time. And their underlying assumptions and inputs differ. Simply averaging their outputs, because in this situation they considered a range of forecasts, may not be a robust enough way of approaching economic growth. And that's quite an important point, sir, because it is noted that these reports are produced by the economic forecasting houses quarterly, so their results will change quarterly. And whilst we've seen there is some similarities between the 2015 report and the 2019 report, they're still embedded in assumptions and various inputs that we don't consider to be robust. In our statement, sir, you'll have noted we've looked at past trends as a viable indicator of growth, and there does appear to be a disconnect between what the Council have seen or observed in past growth and what they're producing in the future. And indeed, if you turn to the Council's latest statement, which was issued last night, so this is the Oxford Economics Report CYC 29. Figure 5 of that report, this is on page 10 for your reference. Figure 5 of that report clearly shows how the history or the noted jobs in York have taken place in the past, and how when the projection looks forward it is completely smoothed out. By the nature of employment growth, we do see some change on a year-by-year basis, and I don't think that's tantamount enough for us to disregard past growth trends as a viable option for looking forward. And again, what we can see through the Oxford Economics Report is very much a plateauing in growth, suggesting that the large proportion of growth that has happened is not likely to occur in the future. And part of the problem with the way that Oxford Economics produced their report is they have their own set of inputs and assumptions. They're not merely suggesting that they are taking on board what the national projections for population growth are suggesting and using those as a direct input. As we can see earlier in the statement, whilst they include trends such as natural change, so they account for the ONS 2016 population projections in relation to fertility and mortality, they make their own assumptions in terms of migration. I'll take you to that in particular, sir, because I think that's important to note. And this is in chapter 3 of that very same statement. Sorry, apologies, sir, it's chapter 4 on page 13. And whilst that indicates that the birth and death rate assumptions underpinning these forecasts are consistent, they've utilised their own view of migration, which shows a sharper slowdown of growth than has been observed. So you have this difficulty, sir, where you're trying to marry up the population and household projections with a forecast that makes its own assumptions of population growth. And the output of that process, sir, is going to be a more diminished position than when we start with. Our view, sir, and we can come back to this if you feel it's necessary, is that it's better to use unvarnished past trends as a more realistic and appropriate approach to consider the future growth of jobs in the district and apply that as part of the modelling process to household and population growth. I think I'll leave it there, sir. I think we're going to come on to market signals and affordable housing later because no one else has touched it yet. Thank you.
Mr. Natkus.
Thank you, sir. There's been a lot said over this session regarding all of this, and Mr. Elvin sort of tried to simplify this approach by saying, well, the NPPF says we should just use the most up-to-date and that's the end of it, but it's not that simple. If it were that simple, there wouldn't be a question on the agenda. If it were that simple, we wouldn't be hearing about these other elements that are discussed. The framework has a whole host of policies in there. For this to be found sound, it has to be positive, which meets those full needs, and it has to be justified. And there was a deliberate change in that justified section of the test of soundness, that the new framework says it must be an appropriate strategy, where the one that we're looking at, the 2012, says it must be the most appropriate strategy. So it is incumbent upon the council to show that this is the most looking forward. And we have to look at what's appropriate for York. And in terms of the 2014 and 2016, we have to look at the specifics. York hasn't had a plan for a long, long time. You know, it's been a long way to get to this position that we're in today. And it isn't really a badge of honour that it hasn't had one since the 50s. It's an abject failure. And it's not just an administrative one, but it's actually a failure for the people who live here. And that's ultimately what we're talking about. And I think it was Mr. Clark earlier who raised the point that it isn't just a paper exercise and a numbers exercise. It's looking at people and where they are. I'm local. I know a lot of local people. Not many of them live here anymore. And the affordability is a massive issue that's come upon. So it's incumbent upon us all to get this right whilst we sit around this table, because it might be a heck of a long time before we sat here again looking at it. So there's no early reviews of anything like that. We've talked about standard method. It is worth just pointing out that...
My apologies, I didn't follow that point. Did you just say there are no early reviews?
Well, sorry, in many circumstances we would say, well, we could look at an early review in 5 years, but in reality, an early review I don't think is an appropriate mechanism on the housing numbers in this location. I've seen other plans that I've been involved in when the number has been reduced with a mechanism for an early review. Leeds was an example that would go back and look at it. But given the difficulties to get here, I think we have to look at the whole plan period and make sure that the homes are delivered in that respect. In terms of standard method...
Am I right to say, Mr. Natkus, that the council will have to look at it in 5 years' time in relation to the standard method?
They would do, yes. So in terms of where we are, the standard method has shown across the region a significant decrease in the amount of homes for nearly all authorities. York is the one that bucks that trend, with the standard method having a significant increase on that. In terms of then why we should be looking at 2014, 2016, one of the points that was raised by the council was to do with migration, and it said that the 2014 figures didn't take into account the most up-to-date figures on migration. With our responses, we had an addendum that was submitted with it, and this looked at migration. And at your leisure, I would ask you to look at table 4.2, which actually looks at the actual migration over the last 10-year period.
Apologies, table 4.2 of...
So it's in the supplementary housing need evidence-based review that came with our responses. It was the addendum to those. And table 4.2 of that looks at the 10-year average in York, which is a figure of 1,705 people.
At my leisure, you say?
Well, I know we've not got much of that time left, but I'll give you the headlines.
I'm not sure what kind of picture you're getting of me spending my leisure time, but I suppose the point being, you don't want me to grab that to hand now?
I'll talk you through the headlines, that's absolutely fine.
Grateful.
Although sadly my leisure time in the last few days has been pretty much reading these documents, so apologies if I confuse you with me. So in here at 7.4, we look at this. So the 2014 based household projections had net in-migration of 1,000 people per annum. The 10-year actual average is 1,700 people per annum. and only one of the last 10 years has experienced net in-migration less than 1,000, which is in the 2014. The most official 2018 mid-year population estimates show net in-migration of 1,700 people, therefore showing that even the 2014 projections are slightly underestimating that. And then in terms of the 2016 base projections, which we were told it take into account the most up-to-date migration, that only is underpinned by a figure of 600 people per annum. So it's 400 people per annum less than the 2014, 1,100 less than the last 10 years average, and 1,100 people less than the 2018 current figures. So on that basis, I can't see how migration could be used by the council to say that that's justification for using 2016 instead of 2014. Just moving on to jobs, we have this new document that's included in front of us, and yes, GL Hearn have used scenario 2, which has been identified. Now, it was mentioned earlier that in our work, colleagues of mine ran the latest evidence through the same scenarios that GL Hearn had used, and the figure that they got to was 690. Now, we use the exact same methodology because if we deviated in any way, we'd be criticised and it would be easy to challenge, so we kept it exactly the same. And the reason why it's different is because we use the same plan period. So we use the plan period, which is exactly what GL Hearn did in coming up with their 650 figure. What this document does is actually use a different figure, which is 2017 to 2038. So it adds dates on the end, but takes off the 2014 to 2017 figure. So that might explain why there's a discrepancy. Don't ask me why, because I don't know the ins and outs of it. But ultimately, by running the exact same figure, we got to the 690. In terms of looking at it, we were told that they're looking to plan positive. Now, table 5.1 of our supplementary document also looks at the options that the council had. And the option that they had was to use the REM, which again, many others use. It has regional details in there. Scenario 1 or Scenario 2 or the simple OE baseline. And the one that the council chose was the fourth lowest. There was only one which provided a lower jobs growth figure. So when they say that they're looking to plan positively, the 4th out of 5 isn't that positive in my opinion. There were other options that they could have done and they could have looked at better. And then there was also a comment about why we shouldn't be using trends. Now again, we've done that. It's included in our statement. You will see that the trends are in there, and we use a trough-to-trough period and a peak-to-peak period, looking at low points to low points and high points over a period from 1991 to 2016. And if you take the average from the low points, the trough-to-trough, that's actually 730 jobs per annum, which is still more than what the council are now positively planning for in this plan. Equally, if you take the peak to peak, it comes in at 975, which is significantly high. But the approach that we take and has been found elsewhere is to take a midpoint between the two, which would come at 850 jobs per annum. But I think whichever way you look at it, taking the OE using the council's methodology, it comes in at 690. Taking an average of the low points brings you at 730. And even if you look at the council's own evidence, there are other scenarios that they could have chosen that they chose not to, which to me shows that it isn't planning as positively as it perhaps could have done. And just finally, Guildford has been mentioned. It's been introduced by the council. I won't go into it in detail. The one thing I would just point is that when I've looked at that, one of the key differences is it talks about the neighbouring authorities and the neighbouring authorities meeting their demands and having higher figures. And I think this comes back to your comment earlier on the mix and match approach, that the difference here is that we've got Selby as a neighbouring authority, we've got Hambleton as a neighbouring authority, both who are going to use standard methodology, both which will use the 2014 figures, not the 2016 figures, and both of which are seeing a drop in their housing numbers. So whereas Guildford could benefit from neighbouring authorities having higher figures, that isn't the case in York, and I think it's a really vital thing to look at. And again, there's a link to those 2014 and 2016 figures, which might have been, apologies I wasn't here yesterday, it might have been the point that was made, that ultimately, if neighbouring authorities such as Selby and York are dropping their figures because they're using 2014, surely this is where we should be looking to increase them to make sure the overall need is met.
Can I just check, Mr. Gard and Mr. McColgan, are you happy for me to carry on? In which case, Mr. Gomez.
Thank you. I've got some remarks to make about employment needs and the OE paper. I was going to reserve those until later if we were going through sort of component by component, but I'll come to those in a minute because we've continued to talk about them. I just want to step back to the use of the 16 projections, which is kind of where we started. The council said that there were parties around the table who were seeking to junk the 16 projections. That's not what we've done. It's not been a junking exercise. It's an objective exercise to look at the strengths of those projections and where they might not be a sound basis for a demographic projection. And that's it. Those concerns, the issues with those 16 projections are in our evidence and at some length in the evidence of others. I would point to a couple of issues which go back to a point that Mr. McColgan made right at the outset of the discussion that we've been having, which is that they had looked at the 16 projections and had some concerns about birth and death rates and migration. What they do in justifying the use of the 16 projections is rely on very short-term trends. What's happened very recently on one big component in particular, which is international migration, and say, well, 1 year's worth of data says that international migration has fallen substantially, and therefore that further lends weight to our view that the 16 population projections are a robust basis to start from. Or we say, and others say, if you look at the long-term trend in terms of international migration, and if you look at what has happened since that work was carried out in later data, international migration has risen again. I would never attach any weight to a single year's worth of data in any event in making projections of this kind. But those international migration rates, which are a big driver of the change, the difference between the 14 and the 16 population projections, is that the view of the 14 projections is actually a lot more consistent with the past trend in York than the international migration in the 2016 projections. That's one issue. There are other issues that people have raised in submissions, and we haven't really gone to in discussing the preference for 16 or 14 population projections. There are issues too with what the 2016 projections assume about the student age population. Very low growth, as I see it in the data over the long term. How consistent is that with what we know about York and its student population? So there are, we think, flaws in the 16 projections which give rise to the need to sensitivity test them, but also to conclude that the 14-based population projections are a sound basis for future population growth in York. On the economics, the OE paper, I had the fortune to be given a paper copy last night, so I sat through the evening and went through it. And the devil with these things is in the detail. We really should have had it before yesterday. We should have had it because, as the council has said, it considers that paper ratifies the view that they've taken about future employment growth in York. I say it doesn't, for reasons I'll come back to in a moment. But I would start on employment by saying that I think this element of the OAN and what's then taken through into the plan is unsound. It's unsound because there is a lack of alignment between the council's position on the employment land it is providing for, how that relates to the forecast figures and the housing need assessment. And I say that because if you turn to SD 063, this is the employment land review update. on my reading, that makes it very clear that the position of the council is that the higher of the forecast it considered, the REM sensitivity test at 806 jobs per annum, is something that employment land policies can provide for, in the sense that there should be sufficient land available to meet the B use class element of that forecast in making provision for employment land. Furthermore, that report goes on to say that neither of the two forecasts, the OE forecast or the REM forecast, are necessarily more accurate than the other. It says that a number of times in that report. That's the council's own evidence. Neither is more accurate than the other. So the question then remains, well, why was 806 not taken through into the plan? Why should it not be a reasonable job scenario for the future to consider? The council has, in its hearing statement, then suggested that its concerns about the health and social care employment, public sector employment contained in that REM forecast were not seen as robust, and that the OE forecast should be preferred. I would take you to the Oxford Economic paper that we were presented with yesterday, and to figure 14. And in figure 14, we have a list of the sector, the individual sector forecasts.
So just bear with me a moment.
Sorry, yes. So figure 14, we have a health and social work sector, which I take to be the equivalent sector to that which the council has contested. And if you look at the differences between what OE was saying at the time of the forecast, the 2015 forecast, and what it's saying now, it's suggesting that growth will be substantially higher in that sector. The difference is nearly 2,000 jobs. The increase over the periods that we look at in this table is 3,100 in the latest forecast and 1,158 in the previous forecast. So I wonder about the council's view on the robustness of that new OE forecast. Does it ratify what the council, the position that the council has taken on this? So my view is that the 806 figure is a reasonable view of future employment growth based on the council's own evidence. It appears to be planning employment land policies which should be capable of meeting that level of growth. Yet that 806 jobs per annum figure has not been tested in terms of its implications for housing need. If it were, the relevant housing need figure would be somewhat higher than 790 DPA, just on the basis of a simple application of the council's assumptions. I suggest that it's somewhere around the 860 DPA mark. There are other reasons why I don't think we can take this new piece of evidence as ratifying the position that the council's taken. This has been touched on by others, and I won't dwell on it, but we read nothing of the underlying assumptions that Oxford Economics makes in its evidence about the working age population, labour force rates, commuting, and we've touched on population already. Oxford Economics assumes something different about the way that the population will change to the assumptions that the council makes in using the 2016 population projections. So you are at risk there of comparing apples with pears. You're using a forecast that's based on inputs on population, the labour force, commuting and so on from the forecasting house, and then you're applying that jobs forecast to a different future population scenario. Elsewhere, that's been called a logical inconsistency. but the Council's evidence is silent on that. I'd also add that on commuting, the Oxford Economics report actually says that for the higher of the two scenarios that it includes in the new report, it says the higher level of jobs growth could be filled by commuters. And this takes me back to a point I made yesterday about engagement with other authorities. If Oxford Economics is assuming that commuting changes, how far has that been picked over by the council and its neighbouring authorities, in particular Selby? So just a couple of further points on forecast to wrap up with. I mean, first of all, the planning practice guidance is very clear. It suggests that forecasts and or past trends should be taken into account. My view is that to do this exercise robustly, you should take both of those things into account. And it's evident from the Council's evidence that it hasn't taken past trends into account in any meaningful way. Secondly, forecasts really should give a sense of the direction of the overall direction of travel. They are prone to changing substantially between releases of forecasts. That is what has happened here. If I'm reading figure 14 correctly, Oxford Economics was saying jobs growth at around just under 0.5% per annum between 2017 and 31. In 2015, it's now saying it's around 0.4%. So that's a big fall in the projected future growth rate. It should, at the very least, raise questions about how a single forecast can be relied upon in that way, and underlines the need to look at other sources of forecasts. And then my final point on this is that there are, again, looking at the tables in detail, and I wish I'd, and others too, had longer to digest this, but there are quite substantial differences between the trajectory of different sectors between OE 2015 and OE 2019. And again, I say that calls into question the idea that they somehow ratify the position that the Council has taken.
Mr. Good.
Sorry to leap in, sir, but if we're going anti-clockwise, I seem to have been missed out when we broke. Could I speak after Mr. Good? Would that be okay?
Mr. Good.
Always happy for you to speak after me. I will be quite brief, actually, because a lot of what I was going to cover has been covered by Mr. Gomez, Mr. Natkus and others anyway. I'll summarise what I was going to say into some fairly high-level points on that basis. We've made quite a lot of the transitional arrangements for obvious reasons. Reading the transitional arrangements, however, we do need to bear in mind it does refer to the framework and the policies therein, and not necessarily the guidance. The guidance is there to guide a decision maker in terms of how they put the plan together. However, we are aware that other plans came forward and were approved, found sound, not slavishly following the PPG as was set out. I won't go through previous examinations, sir, because I've heard your comments and I do quite agree with them. However, we must also bear in mind that there is other guidance, other missives that's been put out from government since that period, which the Council was more than aware of at the time of putting together its information, and the 2016 population household projections have been covered quite extensively. But those principally are the ones I was referring to earlier today. I think it's worth making the point again, because we can quite easily get caught up in the PPG is there, therefore we must follow it slavishly. That isn't what is required of the PPG. It's there to guide a decision maker. It's not there to be policy. Secondly, there is a practical issue to bear in mind. If we were to slavishly apply the Council's methodology, if we refer to the 2019 NPPF, and something you referred to earlier, sir, regarding para 33 of that, it does say plans should be updated every 5 years. However, it does also go on to say that if there is a significant change in local housing need, then it should be done more quickly than that. Now, given it's at least a 25% uplift from the Council's position to what the LHN would be, I suggest that that would require a much quicker review were you to find the sound, which does place the council in rather an awkward position, as it's taken so long to get a plan to this position for the need to quickly review it within 1 to 2 years. It seems slightly farcical when we are where we are. The third point I was going to make was on economics, and I won't go over the issues which Mr. Gomez has probably put far better than I would have done anyway. It is fair to say that it's been quite difficult to catch up with what the Oxford economics paper says because of the lateness of its review. I was unfortunately reading through it early this morning in the car and while sat at this desk. It is, however, notable, and as others have noticed, there is some internal inconsistencies by applying these projections to what the council has done in terms of population. There are internal consistencies in terms of commuting. The council, through various issues at using past trends in terms of pizza slicing, depends what dates you use. I think Mr. Natkas covered that quite well. However, it also depends what dates you use for the forecasting as well. And as we've already discovered, they have used different dates to the plan period. Therefore, it is questionable whether that is a robust way to go forward. Finally, and it will be my final point, because I said it would be quite brief, whilst I have tried to read this paper, and it would be useful if others were allowed to consider it further, it's not clear to me at this point how much of a policy on position that paper actually covers. Now, that may be just simply due to the shortness of time I've had to read it, and I'm sure you're in a similar position, sir. But without that level of detail, we're reliant very much upon what the council is saying, and as we've already said, we've found some problems with some of the assumptions anyway. It doesn't leave me highly satisfied that necessarily we're taking account of things such as York Central.
Mr. Robinson.
Thank you very much, sir. Just 3 main points, if I may. The first point about the housing completions, sorry to kind of go back on that, and I was criticised by the council for using the government's figures, which the council provided themselves, but just on that point, I think it's really important we get a bit of clarity on that, because the council is factoring in the backlog of past under delivery, and they've added on 32 dwellings annually, I think, which is about 512. So if their past completions are incorrect, then presumably that figure would have to go up quite substantially. I know they claim that MHCLG has folded on this issue and has gone with the council's figures, but the discrepancies are massive. I've set out in my submissions in page 47 of my appendix, where we've kind of looked in a bit of detail about the potential discrepancies. Now, I think it's to do with the student accommodation and how they've been banked. Mr. Butler made a very good point earlier about, well, is that really meeting housing need in York? I'd probably argue it isn't. But there seems to be a discrepancy in terms of how the council has been allowing for that. But even there's various examples where it seems they've got some of their figures incorrect, or it still doesn't explain the full discrepancy between the two. And the final point I would make is that presumably the MHCLG was aware of these issues earlier this year when they produced the house delivery test figures. And yet they chose not to change those. So for 2015-16, MHCLG said the net completions were 691 for York, not 1,121, which the council say was delivered. Similarly, in 2016-17, they've got down only 378, not 977. So they must have been able to take the points that the council made on board and decided not to do that. Now, I take the point that it didn't go back for the full 8 years, but they could still have adjusted the house delivery test, and they chose not to do so. And that will have an impact on the extent of the backlog that should be factored in. That's my first point. The second point is the use of the 2016 household and population projections. Now others have made the slightly cheeky point, well, the PPG says the household projection should be published by the CLG, should provide the starting point. Of course, that would be 2014 household projections, not 2016 household projections. But even setting to that one side, as I said earlier, if we are using 2016 population projections, we should at least critique those and provide a detailed analysis as to whether they represent a robust data source going forward. Now, we've heard from the council's consultants that they feel they've done that. I mean, I'd respectfully disagree on that point. Again, if I could draw your attention, I don't know if you have it to hand, but the representations on housing matters that Lichfield has put in, we've got a technical appendix. And on page 20 of that, we've looked at particularly net international migration, which is raised by Mr. Gomez over there. The discrepancy is huge in terms of the past trends for net international migration and what the 2016 population projections suggest will be the case going forward. Now, this is even raised by GL Hearn in their own note in figure 4, where they show you how far the 2016 base, that's page 9 of GL Hearn's work in January 2019, which shows you how much the 2016 base projections dip in terms of their projections going forward for international migration. Now, in our evidence, we've taken that forward another year because we've got the 2018 mid-year estimates. But basically, it shows us that, on average, the last 10 years, net international migration has averaged 1,143 annually. The 2016 population projections drops this to an average of 587 net. So that's a difference of over 550 every year going forward. And you can see on our chart that long-term international migration is almost identical to the figure that's incorporated in the 2014 population projections. Now, this is important because the GL Hearn has sought to model that as part of their alternative scenarios, and have done that in table 5 or page 10 of their house need assessment, January 2019. So that analysis that they've done two sensitivities. One takes the 2016 projections and factors in the mid-year estimates, and that increases the change of population by about 430, which is roughly reflective of the increase in the mid-year estimates. The second one increases the 10-year migration, and that's about 2,000 higher. We've done something similar in our evidence. I have to say it's a much higher increase. Table 3 in my hearing statement suggests that if you were to apply the long-term migration trends, the mid-year estimates, that would come up with a dwelling per annum need of about 690 dwellings per annum, which is significantly higher. I mean, the point I'd make here as well is that GL Hearn don't appear to have taken that on. They haven't translated that into households or to dwelling requirements. But I'm not quite sure why, if you were to have an extra 500 people coming in every year, where you've only got a 2,000 net increase in population over 25 years, over 15 years, which seems to be the case in table 5. So my first point is, you've still got a net increase of 2,000 people. My second point is that it looks low based on past trends. I know it's a lot more complicated than just factoring that in, but it does seem an underestimation. My point would be, even so, that's still 8.5% higher in their scenarios, and GL Hearn has decided not to take that forward. Now, I would have thought that at the very least they could have interpreted that and said, well, what does that mean for household growth? What does that mean for the dwelling requirements? And have that as a valid sensitivity rather than just stopping it there and say, well, it looks broadly in line. It's still quite significantly higher than their baseline. And I would suggest that it doesn't seem to factor in fully the actual increase in international migration. So that's my point on the migration. I would say as well, I agree actually with GL Hearn on the headship rates and the need to accelerate those, and we've done that in our evidence as well. So I agree with that point, but that's only addressing one point. That's not trying to wrap up all these other points. That's just addressing the household formation rates. The final point I'd like to make goes on to economic growth. Again, I concur with Mr. Gomez. I wasn't fortunate enough to have a paper copy of this last night, so I had to look it up online and this morning. I would kind of ask if we could perhaps make submissions on this, given that the Council do seem to be reliant on this as part of their evidence, even if it is to validate their approach. Just going back a step and actually commenting on what is the evidence that's actually before us when we're making these submissions. There are a number of concerns that we had in particular. The first point, and I think it was mentioned by Mr. McColgan, where he said, well, the forecasts are quite susceptible to whichever year you are using. I think that's a direct quote from what he was saying. I fully agree with that. Therefore, when you look at our hearing statements, this is basically there's clear discrepancies regarding the modelling period. It's all over the place. The job growth figure in the ELR relates to 2014 to 2031, whereas GL Hearn projects that over a completely different time period, 2017 to 2037, and saying, well, we're still going to keep the 650 jobs going forward. So, as Mr. McCollum says, the job forecasts are very susceptible to whichever year you're using. which has a knock-on effect. The only other point I would make is, having had a quick look at this economic outlook for 2019, I do have some concerns about some of the assumptions that, and I concur with the points made by Mr. Gomez, but particularly the extent, have they actually taken into account initiatives in that? To what extent have they factored in York Central in their scenario modelling? Or is it, as it said in those two bullets on page 21, they've just increased 20% growth for 3 sectors and reduced it by 10% in other growth areas? Because the difference between the baseline scenario, which is only around 1,200, doesn't, to me, seem to adequately reflect the growth opportunities from the enterprise zone and York Central in its case. So I would like to make more detailed reps on that if we would give us the opportunity, but my observations are there are some clear flaws in that, and it doesn't seem to reflect the growth aspiration of the Council. Thank you.
You look poised, Mr. Elvin.
I was just going to say that if it's convenient, perhaps we could respond to the last batch of points now before we lose track of them. Can I just kick off before handing over to J.L. Hearn with a couple of things? There seems to be an attempt to mischaracterise our approach. I know you know what it is. We're not suggesting slavish adherence to anything. We're just drawing attention to what government policy says, and you have my point on that. And I didn't understand the point that was made by Mr. Good about the PPG, because the duty under Section 19.3 of the 2004 Act is to have regard not only to national policy, but to advice given by the Secretary of State in the form of guidance. So it covers both PPG and MPPF. So I don't know what Mr. Good was referring to there. Secondly, just so you don't as some have done, misread what Oxford Economics has said, there's a point made about that Mr. Cameron Austin Fowle made about this, the different approach to migration at UK level. One shouldn't forget that this is an economic report. The latest statistics from ONS, which were published last month, while it shows a broadly stable pattern of immigration and emigration since 2016, it shows a reduction in long-term net migration for work, which has been offset by an increase in net migration of the student population. And that is largely due to a fall-off in EU immigration. That's the November ONS figures. So one shouldn't forget that in economic terms, the figures are declining. Secondly, you'll see on page 14 of the OE report that despite the trends in Yorkshire and Humber and the region as a whole, where there's net outward migration, York is still expected to have net migration, and that's the 650. And if you want to see, we've had a lot of issues about past trends as opposed to future forecasts, but if you want an indication of volatility in taking averages of trends, you only have to look at the graph in figure 19 to see just how much the population change has fluctuated over the last 10 to 15 years, to see the difficulty in just taking a basket of averages from over that period, or selecting a period in that graph. Hence our explanation as to what we've done. Can I also just point out, the MHCLG position is that they would not alter the published data in relation to the years prior to 2017-2018. The figures that MHCLG has published take account of the planning monitoring from 2017-18 onwards, because those are the returns they accept and are the accurate ones, but they base their statistics on the inaccurate returns prior to that year, which they accept. They've accepted the latest position, but their statistics units just say they will not retrospectively alter published data. So it's a question of looking at what reality is, and we say the planning monitoring is the most up-to-date and realistic approach to monitoring the issue of completions. Other than that, can I hand over to J.L. Hearn, please?
Thank you. I'll just deal very briefly with further issues around 2016 projections. Same issues coming up time and time again. Mr. Ostenfeld said there were substantial changes in the method for the 2016 based household projections. I think just to be clear, there were substantial changes in the method for looking at converting population into households. There was no change in method within the population projections. There was merely an updating of information to take account of more recent information about birth rates, death rates, and migration profiles. So I think just to be clear, because back to points made earlier, we think the projection, the population side is sound, but we accept the household conversion side is not. The point was made about international migration, the suggestion being that those 2016 projections show a much lower level of international migration than the past trends would suggest. That is to be expected. They are following ONS's national projections. At the time of the 2016 projections, ONS projected long-term international migration would run at 165,000 people net per annum, against a backdrop where the immediate past trends have been around the 260,000 mark. So all the work we've done is essentially linking to the national, okay, it's not a national trend, it's a projection, but the pattern that ONS projects going forward. So I think this, we've put graphs in the update reports, and in terms of international migration, that would be figure 4 on page 9. Yes, in short, I would expect international migration to fall below past trends because that is what ONS is projecting at a national level, and what it projects at a national level, it filters down to local authorities. Essentially, the method that ONS uses, it has its national projection, which it publishes normally about 6 months before local projections, and for international migration, it typically takes international migration over the past 6 years and apportions its national figure depending on different levels across different local authorities. So I don't, I'd have to say yes, it is clearly the case that the projections have a lower level of international migration moving forward than past trends, but that is a national factor, that is not an error in data for York, that is what we would expect. The 2016 projections, I think just to note, the 165,000 long-term international migration is slightly lower than the 2014 projections had, which was 185,000. ONS published new national projections in October of this year, and they've revised that slightly upwards again to 175,000. But none of those figures are likely to have a huge impact. But I think just it really is the point that the suggestion that the way you would model an alternative scenario would be to say, well, international migration has been running at 1,100 people, therefore we'll project that moving forward, would be going completely contrary to the way that ONS would look at population projections at a national level. And so our sensitivities effectively take those sort of national assumptions, make adjustments. So effectively we're making an adjustment to the share of migration. So if we're looking at a 10-year period, we're asking the question, well, what was the share of international migration to York in that 10-year period compared to the share in the period that would have fed into the projections? In terms of the final point was made about why didn't we take a slightly higher 10-year migration projection through into household numbers and housing need. The simple point was, having seen the numbers, it was quite clear that projections linked to economic growth were going to be higher. So rather than put something that was going to be essentially overwritten within a couple of pages of a report seemed a bit unnecessary. So I think there's sufficient information in there to show that, yes, if you look at trends over a longer period, we would expect a higher level of population growth. Still, the population growth needed to support the level of the level of jobs that we're suggesting was substantially higher again. That was all I was going to say on that point.
Just addressing the Oxford economics paper. I mean, the purpose of this document really is to show that the 650 figure, which the council are maintaining on the basis, maintaining as the basis of how they're planning going forward. We accept that different periods will show higher or lower rates of growth, and that can be seen through the different parties' assessment of trend-based growth. I should point out that in Table 10 of the Oxford Economics growth, the Oxford Economics Outlook 2019 paper, which is the one that was handed out last night, there's a few good examples of where the different parties and their stance on periods will impact on the amount of growth going forward. Now, the first paragraph on page 10 states that growth over this period, that period being 2008 to 2018, averaged 0.2% per year. Moving on to the next paragraph, it says, overall, we forecast that jobs growth will average 0.4% per year from 17 to 38. So Oxford Economics, on their own calculations, and admittedly that 10-year period is what they have used to calculate a 0.2% growth. If we were to use past trends, then there could be an argument that, in actual fact, a lower level of growth is possible. That's not what the Council are saying, that's just an example of the impact of the trend-based forecast. Also illustrated within that same page is the figure 5. What we see here is that over that 10-year period, even from before that, from 2000 to 2019, you're seeing a fairly flat level of growth. Yes, it does jump around a little bit, but it is, once we get past that 28 figure, you start to see the figure rise for Oxford. But any of the larger growth periods that are being suggested, such as the trough to trough and the peak to peak period, which were being suggested, would in fact take into account that earlier period of growth from 1992 to 1000, which was to 2000, which was clearly a higher rate of growth than what's happened in the 19 years since. We would suggest that that is probably misrepresentative of the current position in York, where if we were to take trends over that period from 1992 to 2000, you would have expected significantly higher growth than what actually occurred. There are many reasons for that, and I accept that, but so too is there many reasons for there being higher growth in those in that 1990s period, such as the digital boom, etc. What we should say is that we expect there to be slower growth, and that's the case for at a national level from all the forecasting houses. As mentioned earlier, that's for a myriad number of reasons, including Brexit, slowing Chinese imports, etc., as well as changing the fiscal, loosening of the fiscal purse, which could see increases, but at the same time reduced export market as well, which would reduce the numbers. The reason why we are confident that the Oxford economic position of 650 is reasonable is that the regional economic model, which did set out an 806 jobs per annum figure, and as Mr. Gomez pointed out, that included quite high growth in healthcare, but in actual fact what that showed was growth in the public services, not just healthcare. So we accept that the new Oxford economic data, and indeed the old Oxford economic data, showed quite significant growth in healthcare. That's really just linked to the growing and ageing population, which is something that we accept will happen. However, much more widely than that, it was the public services sector, which will include such sectors as public administration and defence, and that's the reason why the Council rejected that, because frankly, it has not come to fruition, and it's unlikely to come to fruition with significant increases in the public service and administration services. Further to that, the REM forecast also included a lower rate of growth within the professional and other services to the Oxford economics growth. Therefore, it much more closely aligned with the Council's economic strategy in increasing higher value jobs. So it's not just all about the numbers, it's just about the type of jobs which are being created as well. And that's why the Council decided to go with scenario 2 within the Oxford economic forecast.
Just following on from that, if you look at figure 14, which your attention was drawn to on page 20, you'll see that you can't simply look at the health and social service work growth and look at the difference between the forecasts. You've got to look at the difference across the board, and you'll see that overall there is a fall in other sectors, as the text makes clear, for example, wholesale and retail, as I pointed out earlier. And overall, the difference between the forecasts is a lower expectation of growth between the 2015 and 2019 forecasts. Can I also just ask Rachel Masefield just to deal with the employment land point that was made?
Yes, it was just to pick up on a point made earlier and to carry on from what Paul was saying regarding the Employment Land Review 2017 and the sensitivity testing that was done with the REM model. Sorry, bring it closer. As was said, the fundamental difference in the REM that was sensitivity tested in the ELR 2017, which is SD 063, whilst it was the overall growth was higher at 806 jobs per annum, as we've said, that model anticipated a greater expansion of social and healthcare jobs, whereas the OE, as we've said, was a more consistent size for public service jobs, with the majority of the growth in care offset by the decline in wider public service jobs. And when we looked at the sectors which influence the land allocations for B1, B2 and B8 uses, there were actually lower requirements in the regional economic model than the OE forecast that we were looking at then, the 2015 OE forecast. And professional and other services requirements in the OE forecast were actually higher at around 4,600 compared to the REM, which were around 3,000. So overall, when we translated it through into land requirements, we concluded that the OE projections more accurately reflected the economic strategy in relation to growth in higher value jobs and a more realistic assumption about the public service sector jobs.
And it was also pointed out or suggested that the OE report was looking at an increase in commuting, and that's not actually accurate. If you look at the last paragraph on page 22, above figure 16, it says, net commuting into York, the resident employment rate forecast to rise at a slightly faster pace in that scenario. As population does not change, this can suggest that the jobs will be filled by residents and commuters rather than an increase in migration. It doesn't say it will, it says it can suggest. And can I just ask Rachel to deal with what York regards as being the response to that?
Sorry, yes, just in relation to balancing land requirements, in terms of the plan is obviously trying to provide sufficient employment land to meet the 650 jobs per annum figure that was in the Oxford Economics 2015 work as sensitivity tested in the 2017 work, and is also seeking to balance that by providing sufficient housing land to meet the OAN requirements. So we're seeking to balance between need for housing and need for employment so as not to increase inward commuting and to provide a balance between the two.
And final point, as I pointed out earlier at the top of page 21, it's clear that the Oxford Economics took account of the strategic economic plans for York and does factor in York Central.
Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. Just a quick point, and this may cross over with matters later on the agenda, but I think it's worth mentioning it here. I think we would all agree that it is important to establish the correct housing requirement, as a figure that does not meet the provide for the housing needs of the district and the council's employment aspirations will not result in a permanent green belt. And we are here today, or during these sessions, to establish for the first time a permanent green belt. In this regard, I note that if the plan is found to be sound, it will need to be reviewed within 5 years, and as Mr. Good says, potentially sooner. And this will bring into play the standard method, and if the standard method is employed today, it would give a housing requirement of 1,070 dwellings per annum. This figure is just under 300 dwellings per annum, higher than the housing requirement proposed by the council of 790. The green belt will therefore need to be reviewed early, and it cannot be said to be permanent in the context of the NPPF. And it must surely cast doubt, sir, on the soundness of the council's approach to the housing requirement put forward. That's made even worse by the fact that the council have not identified any safeguarded land. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Pollard.
Thank you, sir. Hopefully two relatively straight observations, and I think they respond to the council's answers then. I guess just on the population inputs and projections, I guess through years it's a question to the council really. Clearly migration is an important factor here. We've heard that the council has satisfied themselves that they think the 2016 population projections are robust and preferred. My observation, and I could be wrong on this, is that in the past, the council's evidence, if we look back, for example, at the 2016 SHMA addendum, highlighted issues around student numbers, and we've heard a number of times around the table reference to student numbers, and that seems to be one of these local factors that is of relevance, as sitting outside of any assumptions around the national forecast being robust. I don't see a lot of, or any real reference to how that's been factored into the thinking around the 2016 projections being appropriate in York. On that, I would draw your attention back to that 2016 addendum, which at the time at paragraph 1.12 highlighted that there was a belief that the university was prospects for future growth was weaker than in the previous decade, and that was where they were flagging up there the 2014 projections might be a little high. My observation is that the representation submitted by, I think it's O'Neill Associates on behalf of the university, paints quite a different picture now as to the university's growth plans. And it's, again, has the council satisfied itself that those points around student growth numbers are sufficiently factored in locally into those estimates around migration, and I guess it's both international and internal migration assumptions in the 2016 data sets. If they are, fine, but I'm not confident that that evidence is before you. The second one really is on the economic point, and really it kind of picks up an answer you've just been given there by the council to some extent. Clearly, what my understanding now is that the council has conceded or recognised that the evidence it was relying on was relatively dated in terms of the economic forecast, hence why we see a new report put in front of you. I'm not clear as to exactly how and why Oxford Economics, well, I guess the parameters that Oxford Economics were asked to re-look at the evidence base. It seems to be, I think you've heard from the council there, to validate or check that the 650 is right. It's not clear the extent to which, and I think it's a point made by Mr. Robinson earlier, that this has actually looked at a refreshed view of the economic context of York and particularly plans for investment, growth, etc. You've just heard reference to the fact, reassurance that it's taken into account York Central. I'm coming at this relatively quickly in terms of this paper, but the reference to York Central is above figure 7, I think, in that paper, and it talks about the fact that
construction, it's validating the fact that construction jobs are modestly forecast to grow, I think by 355 jobs. And it then says, well, York Central could lead to more construction jobs. I think if you go to figure 16 though, in that paper, there's very limited change in, if any, in terms of the construction sector forecasts. So it seems very modest change if that's the impact of York Central. And I think I would just, I mean, again, has the council satisfied itself that Oxford Economics were given, in the parameters of the brief they were set, they were asked to look at projects such as York Central, which is obviously significant investment, and it's not the only investment associated with the growth deal, which again, you know, has put significant money, that is captured in that 1,249 extra jobs over what is nearly a 20-year period. Just seeing if that is fully factoring in, then fine, but that seems quite a modest level of job growth, and I'm sure it'd be interesting in terms of how that sits in any future economic strategy and the levels of investment that have been spent even now.
Mr. Secker.
Thank you, sir. If I briefly introduce, I'm representing the Chamber of Commerce, which, as you would probably expect, represents businesses of all sizes and many sectors operating in York, but what might be slightly less obvious that we also include in our membership many public services, including higher education, further education colleges, both universities, several housing associations, to name just a few, and indeed the council are members. Our membership are regularly telling us of repeated struggles to recruit locally, and increasingly staff having to travel further in order to work in York and find jobs. And also that space is lacking in terms of employment land for growth, and this is causing some of our members to choose to locate elsewhere or to constrain their growth in York. So I think what we've been hearing from our point of view, we really do endorse a more ambitious strategy for York, and I particularly endorse the comments that Mr. Gomez made earlier in terms of employment land and the need for that, and higher housing numbers to enable the employees that we need in York to support the growth, to be able to reside in York on a more sustainable way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. It's been a while, been around the table, so I just want to go back to a point very briefly raised by Mr. Elvin when
yes, I would say it has been a little while, yes, hasn't it, Mr. Keogh? Yes. It's quite a large table, so it does take quite a while to get around. So I would encourage you and anyone else to make the most of the opportunity you get when the light lands on you.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief, but Mr. Elvin earlier referred to, he said, don't listen to what we're saying because we're trying to ditch, I'm paraphrasing, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, don't listen to us, we're trying to ditch the transitional arrangements and the 2016 projections. We're not trying to ditch the transitional arrangements at all. We're simply, we're saying they're being wrongly used and wrongly applied. And in terms of the he also went on to say that we're trying to ditch that in order to drive up the numbers. Well, of course we're trying to drive up the numbers because that's exactly what national policy encourages us to do. I mean, paragraph 47 of the NPPF 2012 is far more explicit than the 2019 NPPF to boost significantly the supply of housing. The now infamous paragraph 47 quote that is almost a quote in every housing inquiry you have dealt with. So we are trying to meet that government agenda. So it seems to me, on the one hand, you've got to assess its technical exercise as to what the OAN should be, based on the information, very interesting information you've been hearing here today. But then you've got to overlay that with the overarching policy objective of the government to drive up housing delivery. And is the number that's been arrived at, is it achieving that overarching national government objective of driving up housing delivery, particularly in an area which is, all parties accept, has one of the some of the least affordable housing, the least affordable housing in the north of England, and ranks very highly in terms of least affordable nationally. So I would simply make that point that the overarching, you arrive at a figure, but is it actually achieving that overarching aim? And I think the balance of doubt is that if there is any doubt that it is too low and that the figure arrived at is not achieving that overarching objective, then you should err on the side of caution and look at the higher numbers. The second point is on completions, and I'm not sure whether you're going to go into completions later on in more detail or whether we can cover that now.
Yes. It's not a thing that in phase one I want to go into in any detail. I mean, clearly it plays into the stuff we're talking about at present, but my intention would be to look at completions in detail under phase two when I look at supply.
Sorry, in phase two hearings?
In phase two hearings.
Right, okay. Well, in that case, I would like to just draw some key figures to your attention very briefly. It's already been raised, but using the council's figures, I know there's been some debate about the government's figures, but using the council's figures, it's in our paper, and stripping out student completions and using the 790 figure, the shortfall since 2012-13, for the last 7 years, the shortfall is 1,761 dwellings. That would mean that you would have to add an average of 103 dwellings a year to the OAN and not the 32 that the council are using. If you look at using the standard method figure, the 1070 requirement, the shortfall is, as you can imagine, much higher at 303. Again, applying the 1070 figure from 2012, the shortfall is 3,721 dwellings, which would mean you have to add an extra 232 dwellings a year to the OAN to meet that shortfall. So I think they're quite dramatic additions to the housing requirement compared to what the council has in its paper. My final point on education. My colleague Mrs O'Neill will be here next week on matter 3 and will deal with the university's plans, but I can tell you that today the university will be submitting a statement of common ground to the council outlining its updated growth projections, and if the higher end of their growth projections are realised, they could be looking at an extra 2,000 jobs in the plan period compared to the figures in the OE report, which I'm just trying to get now on table.
My apologies, Mr. Kerr. Did you say this is a statement of common ground between the university and the council?
Yes. Well, the university are submitting it as a statement.
Sorry, Mr. Kerr. It's something that's going to be submitted.
It's going to be submitted
for our consideration.
It is. Yes. It's a statement of common.
We have not agreed it.
No, sir.
We haven't seen it.
Yes, sir. That's correct. It is being submitted today. It's a statement being submitted today, and it will outline the updated growth plans for the University of York, which at the upper end, if the growth ambitions are realised, could result in an extra 2,000 jobs compared to figure 14 of the OE paper, which looks at a decline of jobs in the education sector. So it supports some of the comments that have been made earlier about the factoring in of growth in education, employment, and how that's been treated in the OE report. Thank you.
Okay, what I'm going to do is hear from Mr. Clark and Mr. Corsia, and then take a break for lunch before hearing from you, because we've heard quite a lot, and I think it gives you a bit of an opportunity as well to make sure that you've covered off everything that you need to whilst you're eating a sandwich. Mr. Clark.
I'll be brief. Just to return to a point I made before, we have been supplied by updated completion figures from the Council when we made our supplementary submission, and the point I made earlier was that the rate of house price increase and therefore unaffordability in York has still run at 50% above the regional average, even though the output and completions have gone up. It has made no difference to the rate of house price unaffordability in York, point number one. And two, we are talking about employment trends entirely in terms of statistics. Two trends which are relevant to this debate and particularly to what we're going to talk about this afternoon. There are 23,000 jobs in York which are below the national living wage, and between 2017 and 2018 wage jobs had a bigger decline in absolute value than any other British city. And I really look forward this afternoon to hearing how the reduced output of new homes by the city is going to tackle the problem of affordability against those statistics.
Mr. Corsia.
Thank you. I would just like to say that I'm representing two of the communities going to be most affected by these housing proposals. So I would take a very different stance, obviously, to others around this table. My starting point, sir, is this, going back to where almost start of this morning, is the 2016 base against the 2014 base, and whether there has been some implication for the government that the 2016 base are unreliable. And so can I take you to a document a government document which hasn't, I don't think, referred to up to now, which is the government response, the technical consultation on updates to national planning policy and guidance. And it's page 7. If I could just read the quote to you. The changes to underlying assumptions in the population projections and methodological improvements to household projections, I emphasise the word, this is the government's view, the improvements, had led to significant variations in housing need at a local level, something that needs addressing in the short term. For the avoidance of doubt, the government is clear that this does not mean that it doubts the methodological basis of the 2016-based household projections. It welcomes the work from the ONS following the transfer of the projections from MHCLG and the steps they've taken to explain the projections, for example, in their recent blog. So that's the government's view on the technical merits of those projections. So we then come to the questions, and I was going to refer to the 2018-based national projections because they tend to support the 2016-based figures. And of course, you'll be aware that those figures, for all the reasons which GL Hearn have given you, will eventually end up in subnational household projections, which maybe even be out before you finally issue your report, sir. May or may not. But the importance of that is they emphasise the trends which we see in the 2016 based. We see the trend towards lower longevity, that is, people dying earlier than previously anticipated in the 2014 based projections. And that has a major implication for the same reasons GL Hearn said on households, number of households at the end of the plan period. And just to be clear, they're also forecasting lower international migration compared to the 2014-based projections. And we say that you also have to, when you bear all this in mind, the differences between the 2012 MPF approach, which was that the assessment of needs should be done locally, applying the latest available information, and that's obviously paras 47 to 50 of MPPF, and the 2018 framework, which requires an assessment of need based upon the standard method, which is, of course, designed to achieve the overall national target. It's a very different approach. And on this point, we're at one with CYC on the issue of using the 2016 based projections as the official demographic starting point. And we're at one with them on that point. And that indeed is their position set out in Housing Needs Update. Because there was a little bit of confusion where I think from GL Hearn what they considered to be the demographic starting point using the guidance from this morning. Where we differ from GL Hearn is their decision not to use the HRRs from the 2016 base projection. We say, sir, that what they've actually done is that their decision isn't based upon local factors, and you've heard much discussion about that. I won't go into that anymore. And we say that what they in effect have done is they've increased the HRRs to provide greater affordability. And we say, sir, that isn't the right place to do that. The right place to do that is through the market signals adjustment. And to have both in the same calculation is in effect double counting. Just going to the employment-led figure, I would emphasise to you that any employment projection is, all employment projections, whatever their source, are notoriously unreliable. And you shouldn't be basing the whole of the OAN on an employment figure. And the dangers of doing that, sir, I think are quite clear. If you look at the RSS employment projections, so I got the wrong note to that. The RSS employment projections, which I've lost, which is their table 11.1. This was done in 2007, was assuming a 2,130 per annum job increase in York. And that was made, sir, 12 months before we went into deep recession. So we think that you have to agree there should be a degree of scepticism about any figure. And so in relation to the latest paper, I've looked at this. Obviously, I've only received this during the hearing session. I would like the opportunity to go away and look at it. I've got questions about this I would like to ask the Council before I actually make any points on it, because I'm not certain if they're good points or bad points. And so I don't think it's fair to ask people to state their formal position on this paper on basically when it's been handed out around the table. Thank you.
Yeah, I will say now, and it was asked well, I was asked about it earlier. I will give people the opportunity to respond to the Oxford Economics paper.
Lest it be thought that we've been sitting on this for 2 weeks. We only got it yesterday. And I had about as much time to look at it as everybody else.
Is that you finished, Mr. Corsia?
At the present moment, yes, sir.
Very good, thank you. In which case I make it 13:06. I'll adjourn the hearing to resume at, let me see, 2 o'clock. Thank you.